Hello, everybody. Welcome into another episode of the Fantasy Pros Football Podcast. I am Ryan Wormeli, joined today by Andrew Erickson, and guest first time on the show, Addison Hayes. He is video manager at BetSperts, primarily with DLF and 4for4 Football. He's at AmazeHayes _ on Twitter. He made sure I got the underscore. Andrew Erickson, of course, also has the underscore. He's at Andrew Erickson _ on his. I'm just at Ryan Wormeli. I didn't need an underscore for mine. I'm just that important, I guess. But yeah, Addison, thank you so much for coming on. First time on the show. You excited to be here? We're excited to talk to you for sure.
Yeah, I'm super excited. I was very happy to get the call. Probably off the bench, I think, from what I've been told, and I'm super excited to be here to talk with you guys through these players.
Well, you're on pace to be sixth man of the year coming off the bench, so we appreciate you filling in for us here, guys. I do just want to mention Father's Day is coming up on Sunday, and I love my dad very much, even despite the fact that he will never hear this because he could not be any less of a football fan. But I wanted to let the listeners know that if they're looking for a last-minute gift for a dad who does love fantasy football, look no further than the Fantasy Pros online store. We've got tons of fun shirts and accessories there at shop.fantasypros.com. We've even put together a list of Father's Day gift ideas for you at fantasypros.com/dad. Guys, today we are talking about players to avoid in drafts in 2023. This is going to be based off where they're ranked currently in ECR, our expert consensus rankings, and half-point PPR rankings. So that's going to be, if you hear us kind of mention those numbers, that's where they're currently ranked. You can find that on the site. Erickson, of course, is extra prepared for today's show because just last week, he actually published an article on the site running through many of his players to avoid this season. You can check that out for a more detailed breakdown at fantasypros.com/avoid. But guys, we're going to go 10-1 players to avoid this year. We're going to hit all different positions. Addison, you are our guest. We will start with you. Who is your number 10 player to avoid this season?
Yeah, so for me, number 10 is James Cook, actually. And I feel like that he is one of the players that, or one of the running backs maybe specifically, that a lot of people might identify as a good RB3, maybe an RB2 if you kind of prioritize wide receiver or tight end early. But to me, I don't feel like James Cook has really much going on for 2023. I mean, they added Dameon Harris, so he's going to be taking away goal line usage and short yardage usage. It's kind of similar, or perhaps even better than what Devin Singletary was doing last year. And James Cook is just kind of filling in this role of like a change of pace / receiving back, but Josh Allen doesn't really throw to the running back. So I don't really buy into James Cook at his RB32 price. I don't necessarily see if there's really anything that's like fantastic upside wise going on at that price. I mean, guys going later than him are guys like Antonio Gibson, who I think has a similar role, but more upside, and at least has done it before. You've got other guys down in there, like, AJ Dillon is in and around there. Brian Robinson is actually in and around there too. Alexander Madison, who I expect to be probably higher at that point by the time people are actually drafting, but he's all in and around there. I just feel like there are other guys with more upside at that point around James Cook. That just doesn't necessarily make sense to me.
Well, you mentioned Antonio Gibson, which kind of segues very nicely into Erickson's number 10, who is another member of that backfield.
Yeah, I'm going with Brian Robinson, RB31 in the rankings, 80th overall. And I just don't see the upside case for Brian Robinson either. Look, there's a whole new offensive coaching staff coming in with Eric Bieniemy taking over as offensive coordinator. Now, he has no allegiance towards Brian Robinson. And last year, the only thing Brian Robinson was good for was getting carries on first and second down that he needed like 17, 18, 19, 20 carries per game to get you RB2 production. So I'm concerned about this Washington Commanders offense and just team in general. They have one of the toughest schedules. So if they're trailing in games, is Brian Robinson going to be on the field? We don't know. It would probably be Antonio Gibson. And they've hyped up Chris Rodriguez to a point where I'm looking at Robinson. I'm like, okay, I see why he's ranked like RB31 because, okay, he should be the starter. He should get volume. But the minute that decreases in any capacity, you're left with a player, an asset that's hit rock bottom. So I think Robinson has just this very, very low downside and floor that is not worth the reward of, oh, well, he ended up being the early down grinder for a bad offense. Yay. Like, that doesn't sound like a win for me, and it's why I'm avoiding him. And I'd rather just draft Antonio Gibson, who always goes later because Brian Robinson is the quote-unquote starting running back for the Washington Commanders as of this recording.
Erickson, I don't think I've asked you previously about Sam Howell, but you're talking about this being a bad offense. You're not a believer in Howell in year two?
I think that he can be interesting. I liked him coming out as a prospect, but he's still a 5th-round pick. And look, we just have to temper expectations. There are rookie quarterbacks drafted in the 1st round that come into the NFL and don't fire on all cylinders. So it's just a lot to ask him how, okay, yeah, go take the offense and make it a top 10 offense. Like, that's just aggressively, ranking a certain player and getting, I think, uncertain expectations that he probably can't reach. Can they be an average offense? Okay, I would say, yeah, probably best case scenario, they have good weapons. But does that really mean Brian Robinson's going to be the driver behind this offense? I think not. I think there are other ways you can attack this offense, which I'll get into a little bit later on.
Addison, give me your next player to avoid.
Next player for me is actually Evan Engram, tight end 8 gone in ADP right now. And to me, I think that a lot of this is really just stemming from what he did at the end of the year, which was fantastic because he was getting targets. He was, converting those targets into high receiving yards and touchdowns. But if you look at more of the majority of the season, specifically like weeks 1 through 12, just to start out the year, he was tight end 19 over those first 12 weeks of the season last year, and then had a really massive explosion that, because of the nature of the tight end position, just drove him up to finishing as a borderline top 5 tight end last year. But I think a lot of that value and a lot of that ADP, again, is stemming from just the fact that he had 3 or 4 games worth at the end of the year, and that's really the last that we remember of Evan Engram from last year, that I just am not buying into that tight end 8 ADP. Again, like, if you're talking about going for tight end, I am much more a person who wants to try to get tight end earlier. So I'm much more willing to go for, a Dallas Goedert, a TJ Hawkinson, a George Kittle, if you're not already getting a Kelsey or an Andrews at the top of your draft. So I'm already not really looking to draft Evan Engram at his price. But even around his price, you got other guys like Pat Freiermuth, David Njoku are going both behind him. Dalton Schultz is interesting down in there. Chigo Konkwu, Greg Dulcich even is down there too as a potential if, Russell Wilson gets better. Sean Payton offense with his tight ends. I just think that he's just kind of in the middle of a lot of other tight ends, or maybe even be the first of this large tight end tier that I just don't really necessarily want to pay that price for him.
Who's your favorite guy in that tier? If you miss out on Goddard and Kittle and Hawkinson, who is it? Chigo Konkwo? Is it Njoku? Is it Freiermuth? Who's the one guy in that range? If you are forced to draft in that range, if you're not going Engram, who are you going with?
Can I cheat a little bit and say go down even further and go to Mike Gesicki?
Yeah, definitely.
Because that's it's not in their same range, but Gesicki is just so cheap right now. But I think that he has a role in this New England Patriots offense that could return him to what he was doing with the Miami Dolphins prior to Mike McDaniel coming to town, and just basically Gesicki just wasn't a fit for that offense. So Gesicki, to me, I think it could realistically be the number 2 target on the Patriots offense. I think it's not even out of the range of possibilities to say that he could be the number 1 target for Mac Jones in the Patriots offense. And if he is, then he could be this year's Evan Engram, essentially.
Erickson, what do you think about Gesicki or that range of tight ends in general?
No, I really like that take from Addison. I was going to drop it. I was like, this is this year's Evan Engram. Like, he's setting this up. But then he delivered. So I'm going to plug that for social for sure. But I think Gesicki makes a lot of sense. And Evan Engram, look, this is also one of the first seasons he stayed healthy. Like, how often has that happened? Jacksonville, I've talked about this on numerous pods and shows. Jacksonville was one of the healthiest teams last year. That's not going to repeat. So who's a candidate to probably get hurt? Probably Evan Engram, could be, considering he's been hurt almost every year of his career except last year when he was his best. So,
well, speaking of players who are a candidate to get hurt, hit me with your next player to avoid.
I'm looking at Kadarius Toney, and for the Kansas City Chiefs, he is wide receiver 39, 97th overall. Now, that might sound like, oh, you're not really investing that much, but it's not just the investment on draft day with Kadarius Toney. It's the absolute headache every single week you're going to have to do to try to figure out what to do with this guy on your roster, because it's going to be a tease every single week. And I fell for this last year. I was all in on the Giants. I was like, he's got high upside, but could totally finish outside, the top 50, top 60. And that's what he did. And I was like, I'm not doing this again. Like, why am I doing this again with Kadarius Toney? I did not like him as a prospect. He hit that one good game against Dallas, and that's it. What happened the last time we drafted a player in a high-powered offense after one good game, assuming he would have an expanded role? Yeah, that was Gabe Davis. What happened? Didn't work out. And now we have Kadarius Toney. Oh, he's going to have an expanded role. Well, last year in the playoffs, 2 weeks to prepare in the Super Bowl. What are they doing with Kadarius Toney? What's happening? Oh, in the Super Bowl, he ran 5 routes. 2 more than he ran in the AFC Championship game, which was 3 routes. Like, I get he'll have a bigger role than that. But there's a chance he doesn't. What if they like Sky Moore more than they like Kadarius Toney? I think Sky Moore is a much better bet. You're looking at his usage from the slot. He was top 5 in terms of yards after the catch per reception last year. Everyone's pointing to Kadarius Toney's yards per route run and target rate per route run. It's all off the charts. It's like, well, Sky Moore, when he got opportunities last year, he was pretty efficient too. His yards per route run wasn't great because he was actually running routes. Like, that's the thing. Like, eventually you actually have to accumulate enough routes to actually score fantasy points, which Toney has yet to show. So for me, I'm just out on Toney. I'm going to place my bets on other Chiefs receivers that are cheaper.
You mentioned the headache, and I just want to quickly follow up. Does that mean you might be more interested in drafting him in best ball where you don't have to worry week to week and just know you're going to get those spike weeks? Because it is a pure upside play, right? Taking Toney, especially in this range.
I mean, I guess, but it goes back to, it's a crutch argument with, oh, well, this receiver, he's better in best ball. Well, like a lot of receivers are, because it's the hardest position to project on a week-to-week basis. And of course, Kadarius Toney kind of highlights that effect. So yeah, if I was forced to take him, I'd prefer it in the best ball format for sure.
All right. Kadarius Toney is being drafted 91st overall in FFPC drafts right now. And speaking of, the Fantasy Pros Championship at FFPC is here to test your skills. Battle for your share of the $6 million prize pool, including the massive $1 million grand prize, and also score free subscriptions to both Fantasy Pros and Betting Pros, which I think is great, but maybe admittedly is a little less exciting than potentially winning $1 million. I will let you be the judge of that. Register now at fantasypros.com/championship and use promo code FantasyPros for $25 off your entry. Outplay your competitors in a 12-team league throughout a 12-week regular season with weekly waivers, lineup choices, and no trades. Rank among the top 2 or win your league's playoffs to move on to the championship round and compete for the grand prize during weeks 15 to 17. You also have the chance to compete against the Fantasy Pros crew. Erickson's league is drafting August 28th at 4 p.m. Eastern. My league is drafting August 23rd at 7 p.m. Eastern. And of course, Fitz, Debro, Mayer, and Kelly all have leagues of their own as well. Again, visit fantasypros.com/championship today and use promo code FantasyPros for a $25 discount. Now get ready to go out there and dominate. Guys, let's get to our number 8 players to avoid. Addison, starting with you.
Number 8 for me is Mike Evans. I feel like this is kind of the first layup probably of the day so far, with just avoiding the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense kind of almost entirely this year. Maybe outside of a couple other players that, depending on their ADP, could be interesting. But Mike Evans, for me, I'm not buying into it. Last year, he was a good receiver at end of year rankings because he dropped a nice 40 bomb for you in the championship game. But if you take away that one game, he was wide receiver 26 up to that point, which is still a little bit higher than his wide receiver 32 ADP right now, but you're inching closer to that buying in and drafting a player at his ceiling. And with Baker Mayfield and the highlights and stuff, low lights, I guess, is more an accurate description for what we've seen out of training camp. Kyle Trask, I'm just not really buying into this passing game for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I mean, Mike Evans is going to be another year older. I don't think he really has a whole lot of ceiling left in him. I think he might be fine for you on a floor basis just because he will see a solid target share, but there are also a bunch of other guys in his range. And this is really my main argument, as I just don't like these guys around their ranges of where they're at. Like, you look at who's around him in ADP right now. Brandon Ayuk is 2 spots above him. Christian Kirk is 1 above him. Hollywood Brown is 1 behind him. Deontay Johnson is also behind him too. Treylon Burks, Jahan Dotson, some upside names in there too. I just don't really want to buy into Mike Evans at this current wide receiver 32 price, because I think that this Buccaneers offense is going to be pretty bad. And I think that's really going to impact Mike Evans' fantasy production.
Ironically, in FFPC, Evans is actually 92nd overall in ADP, which is 1 spot immediately after Kadarius Toney, who another guy that we don't like apparently on this show. Erickson, give me a wide receiver here that you're looking to avoid.
So this name might be surprising. I'm going with Terry McLaurin for the Washington Commanders, wide receiver 49th overall. Look, when I'm drafting wide receivers in the middle rounds, I'm really looking for guys that can jump the status to wide receiver 1 territory. And Terry McLaurin has been a locked and loaded wide receiver 2 throughout his entire career. Now, a lot of it's because of the quarterback play has been up and down. But look, going back to Sam Howell, he's probably going to be okay at best. So that means Terry McLaurin's going to be a wide receiver 2 at the end of the day. Now, that's where you're drafting him. But there's no room for growth here. Like, I'm not drafting players so I hope they meet their ADP. I want them to exceed their ADP. And I think that in the range he goes, where you're seeing players like a Drake London, Ridley, Godwin, Judy, Christian Watson, like there are guys you could see taking a level jump where I'm willing to sacrifice the floor that McLaurin offers. Like, he's not going to be a bust. He'll be a top 24 wide receiver when it's all said and done, basically no matter what. But I'm not going to get that top 10 season potentially like I could get with one of these other breakout candidates. So I think that when I just look at the Commanders specifically, I prefer Jahan Dotson at cost more than Terry McLaurin. Jahan Dotson had more wide receiver 1 finishes last year than Terry McLaurin did. He played in 5 fewer games, and people will point to, oh, we scored more touchdowns. Like, yeah, we want our guys to score touchdowns. Like, Jahan Dotson was featured in the red zone. And if you look at the splits with Terry McLaurin when he doesn't have Taylor Heineke, always looking at him with like a 30% target share, McLaurin was a wide receiver 3 and 4. Like, he was not really great for your lineup if Taylor Heineke was not starting games. So who am I to say that Sam Howell is going to prefer Terry McLaurin in this brand new offense? There's a lot of question marks. And I just think that McLaurin feels safe, but I think that he doesn't have as much upside as you think that he might have. And maybe his floor isn't as high. So I prefer Jahan Dotson, some of those other names at cost, prefer instead of McLaurin at wide receiver 20 at 62nd overall.
Do you think at all, I know I already asked you about Sam Howell, but do you think the addition of Eric Bieniemy into this offensive coaching staff might help sort of unlock some things for McLaurin?
I mean, what has that done? What Chiefs receiver has been unlocked in Kansas City? I mean, it was Tyreek Hill. Is Terry McLaurin Tyreek Hill? I'm like, no. So for me, it just goes back to, look, I can't be overly optimistic about, Washington's just going to totally smash expectations with a quarterback that's made one NFL start. Like, I think that's just over aggressive. And again, going back to, okay, if this Commanders offense can surprise, I want to invest in that through ways of Antonio Gibson, through ways of Jahan Dotson, the cheap ways to invest in a Commanders offense if they exceed expectations, not taking Terry McLaurin in round 4. Like, because that's too heavy of an investment based on the ambiguity and the question marks about this offense.
Terry McLaurin, just for the record, again, an FFPC going 63rd overall. Currently, Jahan Dotson down at 97th. So definitely a sizable gap there. Addison, who's your next player to avoid?
Next player for me, we're going to dip into the quarterback pool here, and I'm going to talk about Daniel Jones, Vanilla Vic over here. So, and QB12, like, you might see that ADP and say, well, that's actually below where he finished last year, because he was actually a top 10 quarterback last year in points per game and in total points. But I think that there are things that happened last year that are not necessarily sustainable heading into this season. I mean, if you look, number one, the really big reason why he was even that high up in fantasy rankings to begin with was because of 700 rushing yards, 7 rushing touchdowns, which was on a 120 rush attempts, which if you look at, just his rushing career logs, that is an anomalous season in terms of volume and rushing touchdown efficiency that I don't necessarily know is going to be there again in 2023, especially whenever you pair it with everything else that he had going on with him in the passing game. Like, you might say that he had a really good season last year. Brian Daboll, kind of helped unlock Daniel Jones, but it wasn't all that dissimilar of a season to what he had the previous 3 years. And if you actually look at it, he had 10 games under 200 passing yards. He had the lowest number of passing yards per game in his career, just barely under 200 yards. Last year was also the lowest ADOT and yards per completion that he had in his career as well, too. And I mean, to his credit, he did throw only 5 interceptions, but he also only threw 15 touchdowns in 16 games played. So he's still averaging less than 1 passing touchdown per game last year. So I guess, like, Brian Daboll, to his credit, he did kind of unlock Daniel Jones, but what that meant was that he just turned him into more of a game manager. Don't, turn the ball over. Just don't lose us this game. And the rest of it will kind of all play out. And so I think that's kind of going to be the same thing going into 2023 again. Yes, you could say that they improved, quote unquote, improved their offense by adding Darren Waller, who's a 32-year-old tight end who has only played 20 games in the past 2 years. They added in Paris Campbell, who up until last year also struggled mightily with injuries. They added Jalen Hyatt, who is strictly just a vertical guy, doesn't really fit with the low ADOT offense that Daniel Jones had last year. So I don't really know if these are should be seen as upgrades, even though on paper they kind of are over what they had last year. So I think that you're just really hoping that he takes a step forward, maintains that rushing volume, And I don't know if one or even both of those things are going to happen in 2023 to meet this ADP.
Worth noting that also just this morning there was talk about Saquon Barkley maybe being willing to skip games this season, and that is of course only going to hurt Jones as well, just because A, it hurts the offense, and B, the pass catching ability of Saquon. So I mean that's kind of another knock against him. Erickson, who's the next player you're avoiding?
Going to the running back position here with DeAndre Swift, running back 25. He's going 62nd overall in the ECR ranks. Now, he's on the Eagles now, so everyone is hyped up. Oh, great offensive line. He's going to be super efficient. Well, he was already super efficient on a per-catch basis in Detroit, but I'm concerned about the targets. Is DeAndre Swift going to be used enough in the passing game with Dallas Goedert, with A.J. Brown, with Devontae Smith, all clearly ahead of him in the target pecking order of this Eagles passing attack? Looking at last year, the Eagles had the lowest target share to the running back position at 12%. Like the Lions were way up there near the top 10. So for me, I'm looking at Swift. That's the best asset he can offer to a team is his receiving ability. And he's on the one team that I would argue needs it the least amount. So I understand he'll be efficient on the ground. Like, yeah, he's going to put up 5 yards per carry. Yeah, sure. Like, that'll be great. He did the same thing last year. And how good was he in fantasy? Not great. He was getting outproduced by other running backs, being featured over other running backs, especially in the red zone. Look, Rashad Penny is a better pure rusher than DeAndre Swift is. There's no doubt in my mind about that. So if Penny's healthy, I think Penny's going to be the guy that's on early downs. And DeAndre Swift will be, third down back on a team that doesn't throw the ball to the running backs. Okay, like where is the upside here with DeAndre Swift? So, and then you factor in the other layer of he can't stay healthy. Like he's been banged up all 3 years of his NFL career. So for me, DeAndre Swift, low commitment by a new team. I mean, just got traded away from the Lions and they could replace him. They were like, by a team that we're all very hyped about with the Detroit Lions and their offense and what they're doing. They didn't want him. They didn't want Swift. So for me, I think there's enough red flags with Swift's overall profile that had me shying away from him, especially at the cost of he's your RB2. Like you got to draft him as an RB2 and you're starting that guy week 1 most likely. And I'm like, do I want to start DeAndre Swift week 1 against the Patriots? Maybe not.
How much of his struggles in Detroit do you think was just the fact that the Lions, for whatever reason, like very clearly liked Swift less than most people watching football do? Because it seemed like he has been a guy for a couple of years now who has been, he's so talented, he's in this great position, should do really well, and then the Lions never used him the way we wanted to. Is that like a Lions thing, or do you think that's representative of Swift's just ability to be an impact running back in the NFL?
I mean, maybe he has to do. I mean, I don't know DeAndre Swift personally, so I can't like look at him and say, "Oh, well, you're not tough. Like you don't have grit." But it seems like that's something that the Lions had an issue with, that he wasn't available enough to take on heavy loads. And Deuce Staley had always talked about how like you can be such a good running back, but like you are not reaching your ceiling. So eventually the Lions got fed up and they're like, "All right, we're going to move on from you." The Eagles were smart to take a flyer on DeAndre Swift. They didn't pay a lot to get him. So there's no incentive really for any of these running backs to be the guy there. So for me, again, with a lot of these players to avoid, it's because I view other options either in their area or options on their own team as better ways to invest into that position or into that specific offense. So for me, I'd rather just take Rashad Penny in round 12. I'll get the good games that he plays till he gets hurt, and then I'll be done.
And we've seen Philly in the past too. They're an organization that likes having a running back by committee. They don't like having the one guy that has 300 touches in a season. But with Swift and Penny's injuries histories respectively, that they're going to kind of take it easy on those guys to try and keep them healthy as best they can. Also, we talk about this all the time, but like Jalen Hurts will steal those goal line carries and those touchdowns that we'd want to see go to those guys. You already mentioned just the target share. Like they have a couple of elite wide receivers. Like there's just so many mouths to feed in that offense. Like, even if he is really efficient, which I kind of expect he will be, you're right. That probably won't lead to a ton of production. I think Swift's a really interesting person to talk about. So I want to get your opinion too, Addison. What do you make of Swift going into this season?
I do agree. It seems like his value is hyped up a little bit higher than where it probably should be, just because he's moving to the Eagles, moving to a fantastic offense. The potential that a team actually uses him the way that we all think that he should be used. But I do agree with what both of you guys said. I mean, it just seems like that there isn't a big enough piece of the pie here for DeAndre Swift in either the receiving game or the rushing game to really make a massive impact. And his fantasy production largely has been from the receiving game in Detroit. And so if that even takes a hit, and then that's just not necessarily going to be what we want to see. And he's going to have weeks. I'm sure there's going to be weeks. It's Philadelphia. They're, like you said, they run a committee approach. So one week it's going to be a DeAndre Swift, and Rashad Penny only gets like 4, 5, 6 touches, and Swift scores twice because he's that talented. But then you're also going to have a week where Rashad Penny has all of a sudden now 14 carries, another couple touches in the receiving game. And, I think it's just going to be a massive headache all year to figure out this Eagles backfield. And I don't want to invest in DeAndre Swift that highly, like what Andrew said, as him as your RB2, maybe even your RB1. If you see him as, that guy that you think can be a top 12 guy, you invest heavily in running and wide receiver and tight end, he's your RB1. I'm not buying into that.
Addison, hit me with your next player to avoid.
So the next player for me, and this one is just so baffling to me. I don't get it at all. Courtland Sutton is being drafted as the wide receiver 40 right now. Like that, and you might say, well, that's not that high. It's wide receiver 40. Anybody at that range really just kind of becomes a flyer and isn't really all that much more important to you outside of just being nice depth in case somebody were to get hurt. But if you look at Courtland Sutton, first of all, that ADP is higher than both finishes he's had over the past couple of seasons. He finished as the wide receiver 43 and the wide receiver 45 in 2021 and in 2022. So we're drafting him higher than where he has finished in each of the past 2 seasons. Then you look at what the Broncos have done this offseason. They added Marvin Mims in the second round. Tim Patrick is going to come back from ACL injury, who, if you remember, Tim Patrick actually signed a very similar contract to Courtland Sutton and signed it first a couple of years ago before that ACL injury. So there are just going to be more mouths to feed. Javonte Williams is going to be coming back. Greg Dulcich maybe could take a second step forward in his second year. It just seems like there are more mouths to feed, and this is kind of a crowded receiving room for targets that is not just going to be de facto Courtland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy are getting all of the targets because they're the only 2 people there. And so we've already seen that with 100 to 110 targets that Courtland Sutton has had over the past couple of years, that he can't even break out of wide receiver 40, out of this ADP. There's really no ceiling. So I don't really understand what the heck we're doing here with drafting Courtland Sutton this high. I mean, you have all these other players that have such higher ceilings that when you are drafting this low, this far down here, you want guys like Andrew said that could take, a step forward and beat their ADP, not just reach that ADP, but beat it and perhaps even beat it drastically. You got Jackson Smith-Njigba, the rookie in Seattle. Gabe Davis, honestly, I think could beat wide receiver 42, or at least if you're able to predict the 3, 4, 5 weeks that he does well, then that'll pay off more for you than Courtland Sutton. You have, Jacoby Myers down in there, who's, I think, a better floor option for you. Quentin Johnston, another rookie. Michael Thomas, if he stays healthy. There are so many more options down in that range that just have much higher ceilings than Courtland Sutton. That ADP makes absolutely no sense to me.
Quick note, just because you mentioned Tim Patrick, from talking to people that cover the team last summer, I'm out here in Denver, Addison. So I know some people that cover the team. They told me unequivocally before the injury, Tim Patrick was Russell Wilson's favorite target, like by a mile. So if he is back fully healthy and back to where he was and that connection is there again, there are a lot of mouths to feed in that offense, but that's somebody that Russell Wilson likes looking at. Erickson, obviously you very famously loved Courtland Sutton last year. I believe we once put up on social a quote graphic of you saying that he would be, talking about last year, he would be this year's Cooper Kupp. Obviously, you are much lower on him this year than you were last year, but what do you think about 40 being too high, like Addison says?
I mean, I have him as wide receiver 47, so I do think it is too high for him there. And look, the whole Denver Broncos experience just didn't work out in terms of Russell Wilson, being a top tier passer. But even when you look at how that offense played out when Russell Wilson was playing poorly, Jerry Jeudy still stood out. Like Jerry Jeudy broke out last year. Like it happened at the end of the season. Like he was efficient enough despite how awful the offense was. And a lot of that has to do, even when Sutton's been on the field with Jeudy, the splits are just very, very heavily favor Jeudy in those particular situations. So for me, Sutton, the one thing he checks off when I'm looking for receivers is touchdown regression. But that's not considering all of the new pieces and additions this offense has made, like a Dulcich taking a step in year 2. It's a new coaching staff. Like that's a big thing. Like Sean Payton didn't come over here with Courtland Sutton in mind necessarily. He's inheriting Courtland Sutton. So he can choose what to do with it. And the fact that they drafted a wide receiver with their first pick when receiver did not look like a need necessarily, especially a guy like Marvin Mims, who I liked a lot. I mean, is Sutton a full-time player in this offense? Like, I just feel like Sutton is leaning more in the Allen Robinson type of range versus the other direction. Allen Robinson were drafting round 4 last year. That's where Allen Robinson was ranked. And Matthew Freeman, famously of Fantasy Pros, was super stout on his take that he would rather have Julio Jones than Allen Robinson last year. And he was ridiculed for it, but he was right. Julio Jones gave you more weeks than Allen Robinson did last year. I mean, it wasn't many, but it was a few weeks. So I think Sutton, half PPR, I get the touchdown upside, but besides that, yeah, not super excited.
Not only Mims being their first pick, but they traded up to get him, right? It was like they wanted to go and get their guy. Erickson, let's stick with the Broncos for your next player to avoid, which is Javonte Williams. And I will just say before you get into it that this is probably the name I agree with most on this entire list. I think where he's going is way too high right now.
Yep, Javonte Williams, RB28, 72nd overall. Look, a lot of it has to do with he's coming off a devastating knee injury. And I'm not a doctor, but I consult one, famously from Fantasy Pros, Deepak Chona. He was on our show that we did a Sunday recap, doing a lot of the injury analysis and just kind of looking at his kind of take on the Javonte Williams injury. Look, he's skeptic. He's very concerned about Javonte Williams the start of the season. And I think we all should be. It makes a lot of sense. Like, they signed Samaje Perine. They took him away from the Cincinnati Bengals, who wanted to re-sign him. They signed him to a good deal. And Sean Payton has had a history of using committee backs. Like, he doesn't. Who's been the Saints' number 1 running back? Oh, it's been Kamara. And Kamara's always been someone that they've monitored touches around. So for me, if there's concerns about Javonte Williams being super efficient, like he has been when he's been healthy, when is that going to happen? Like, when will he end up returning to form? You know, Deepak is looking at week 8. Okay, so we're going to get a running back. Maybe he's available. Maybe he's not. Maybe he's not 100%. Okay, he's not as efficient as he was. And that's really been Javonte Williams' calling card in the NFL. Tackle breaking machine. But he's not been a player that's absorbed a lot of volume. And this goes back to his college profile. This goes back to his NFL profile. Javonte Williams has never been a bell cow. People are looking at me like, wait, what do you mean? He's a smash. Like, he has so much upside. You mean RB1? It's like, when has Javonte Williams ever been an RB1 in fantasy? It has not happened yet. We were hoping it would happen year 1. Didn't happen. We were hoping last year was going to happen. Didn't happen. He split touches with Michael Carter in college. He split touches with Melvin Gordon both years in his NFL career. What team is Melvin Gordon on? Last time we saw him win a Super Bowl with the Chiefs. He was on the Chiefs? Yeah, Melvin Gordon on the Chiefs. So for me, Javonte Williams is a committee back even if he is healthy. If he's healthy, he's going to be a committee back in the Denver Broncos offense that last time I checked wasn't that good. So for me, yeah, he's a top 30 running back that I don't want. It's just going to be a headache. It's J.K. Dobbins all over again. Like, I feel it's so clear in my mind that, yes, Dobbins eventually ended up being productive when you could pick him up off the waiver wire. You know, week 14, week 15, when you were already out of contention because you drafted him in round 4. So, yeah, I'm out on Javonte.
Yeah, I'm less pessimistic on the offense in general and on what he can do when healthy. But to me, it's the Dobbins comparison is the one I would make too. It's purely about the health. Like that, it's not a typical ACL tear. It was whatever else was included with it, similar to what Dobbins went through when basically his entire knee needed to be reconstructed. That's like what Javonte went through, and I just don't trust that he will be anywhere close to healthy by week 1 or by week 6, like maybe by like week 12 or 14, at which point you're not going to be in the fantasy playoffs anyway if you drafted, if you put a lot of draft capital into Javonte Williams. So to me, it's strictly about the injury, but there's just no way I'm drafting him where he's going right now. Before we get to the guys' top 5 players to avoid this year, I would like to announce the winner of 1 year of a free upgrade to Fantasy Pros Premium. Congratulations to Aldwin Parchment. Please get in touch with our customer support agents at mailbag@fantasypros.com with proof of your subscription to the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel and your current fantasypros.com username, and we will get that upgrade processed for you as soon as possible. Again, the winner is Aldwin Parchment. Congratulations. And for everyone else listening, if you want to win a free year of Fantasy Pros Premium too, subscribe to the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel and comment below on this video, because when you do, you could win a free upgrade to Fantasy Pros Premium, whether you're looking for custom mock drafts, salary cap tools, or in-depth analysis of your fantasy performance. Fantasy Pros Premium has the most powerful tools in the industry to help you win. But if you can't wait for the giveaway, sign up today at fantasypros.com/premium and start playing smarter, not harder. Guys, we're on to the top 5 now here. Addison, who are you avoiding?
we finally get to talk about him. And I'm going to preface this by saying I am a Steelers fan, but boy, do I hate George Pickens' ADP. Wide receiver 37 is so high for a player that is really nothing more than a wide receiver 3. Like that's basically it. And again, this goes back with like the Courtland Sutton discussion. What Andrew's been saying this whole time, just like we don't want players in these ADPs that are just going to meet that ADP, and you're just going to be, you're going to be fine getting back exactly what you paid for it with George Pickens or with Courtland Sutton. And I think that's what we're going to see with Pickens. This Steelers offense is still going to be bad in 2023. Matt Canada is still the offensive coordinator for God knows whatever reason. Kenny Pickett is not it. He sucks. He is not a long-term future option for the Pittsburgh Steelers, no matter what any other Steeler fan wants to tell me. He is terrible. And George Pickens, thank God that he's a good contested catch receiver, because that's the only way that he would make catches anyway, because he's not a good route runner. Kenny Pickett is not an accurate passer. So the only way that he's going to make catches is by making those highlight reel contested catches, which, by the way, every single week when you see a highlight reel catch from George Pickens, that catch was 50% of his production that week. That's essentially what it was. From week 9 on, he had as many games with just 6 targets, which was the highest that he saw over the second half of the season in a game, was 6 targets. He saw as many games with 6 targets as he did with 3 or fewer targets. That's not going to get it done when you're looking at a player in this kind of range who we want to take that leap forward. He's playing behind a target hog in Deontay Johnson. And say whatever you want about Deontay. He is much better than George Pickens. He is the alpha wide receiver in the Steelers offense. He's going to see 8, 9, 10, 11 plus targets per game. That just is what Deontay Johnson is. And he's going to have touchdown regression in his favor. He only scored 0 last year. And I say only scored 0. He didn't score at all. And so Deontay's going to have a much better year next year. George Pickens could be the reason why that touchdown could be the reason why George Pickens isn't necessarily doing the same or is not improving in year 2. And the reason why I specifically highlighted the second half of the year last year was that was the Steelers offense without Chase Claypool. So that is essentially the same opportunity, same role that he has this year. They still have Pat Freiermuth, they have Najee Harris, they have Deontay Johnson, like I just mentioned. That they signed Allen Robinson. I know that that's not necessarily Allen Robinson anymore, but like there's a reason why they have all these other players and guys that can just see a nice target share cut into George Pickens' workload, and I just don't see a year 2 breakout for him. Especially, Matt Canada is the big problem, but I just don't see it at all in 2023.
That is pretty emphatic from Addison. Erickson, we don't have a ton of time, but I want to quickly ask you, because you are the highest among the FantasyPros staff on Pickens this year. What are you seeing that Addison isn't?
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily high on George Pickens internally. Like, I may just have him ranked maybe I just hate him less than the other analysts. Maybe I'm just a little bit more, tantalized by, his 18-year-old breakout age at Georgia and those types of things in the contested catches. But for me, it's still, Deontay Johnson till I die. Like, that's what I want. Like, just to be clear. And the only time I'm taking George Pickens is if someone was smart and took Deontay Johnson first. Like, that's really the only scenario where I'm taking someone like Pickens, because I recognize that I think he's a talented player, but, at the cost, most of the time I'm not necessarily picking him. But I just want to recognize his talent, which maybe is the reason why he's ranked a little bit higher for me versus some of the other experts. But not necessarily, he's not the Steelers wide receiver I'm pounding the table for. That guy is definitely Deontay Johnson.
All right, give me your tight end you're avoiding, Erickson.
George Kittle, tight end 4, 50th overall. So I don't know. With Kittle, it's just, for me, it's weird because everything that he did last year is not sustainable long-term. Basically, when he was on this tear at the end of the season, he was averaging 1.5 receiving touchdowns per game. That's not something that we can project any player, specifically at the tight end position, to continue into the next season. Now, people will point out, he has really big upside. He has these spike weeks. Yeah, a lot of tight ends, especially in the elite tier of tight ends, they do. And that is what helps separate George Kittle from some of these other players. But the fact that you have to use a tight end 4 as a top 50 pick, like you are foregoing top tier wide receivers and running backs that I think have way higher floors and equally high ceilings than George Kittle has to offer. Even when Brock Purdy was at quarterback, Kittle was not the number 1 in target share. It was Deebo Samuel when the games he was healthy, and then it was Brandon Ayuk. George Kittle was tied with Christian McCaffrey for 3rd in targets per game or in total target share with Brock Purdy at quarterback. So we say this a lot with these 49ers players that you have to take the cheapest guy. And right now that's Brandon Ayuk. It's not Kittle. It's not Deebo. It's Brandon Ayuk. That's who you want to invest in because when they're all healthy, none of them can really be trusted. Like they're all kind of mediocre at best, or besides Christian McCaffrey, who's getting the majority of touches as a running back. But the receivers, it's really tough to trust them week in, week out unless somebody misses time. So for me, George Kittle, there are so many other tight end options I'm going to draft Darren Waller 4 or 5 rounds later than George Kittle. I think he has a very similar ceiling in terms of, well, he could be the number 1 target on his offense. George Kittle might be the number 4 target on his own offense. Brock Purdy, what are we going to get from Brock Purdy? I don't know. So for me, there's just too many concerns with George Kittle, especially as ADP is just way too high for me to invest in when I can take other tight end options or just punt the position entirely.
So I was going to ask, what will your approach to tight end be? We know that Addison's going to be getting a lot of Mike Gesicki. Are you going to be Erickson drafting a lot of Travis Kelce because you're going to be the guy who tries to get the first tight end off the board? Are you going to be waiting till that sort of tight end 10 to 14 range, try and hit on a sleeper? Or are you just going to be looking at some of these other guys in the middle, like a Waller, like a Goddard, like a Hockenson? What's your approach here?
So like for me, it's Mark Andrews. If I can get him at a little bit of a discount, whether that's in end of round 3 or round 4. And then if I miss out on Andrews, I'm skipping this next tier of tight. I'm taking whoever falls last. So for me, it's always Waller. That's the reason why I'm not drafting Kyle Pitts. I see the upside case with Pitts, but he always goes ahead of Waller. So I'm like, I'm not reaching on Pitts. I'll just wait to draft Darren Waller. For me, he's the latest tight end that is drafted with the most upside. And that's how I approach these onesies positions. Like, don't be a hero and draft George Kittle 50th overall when you can draft Darren Waller in the 80s. Like, I don't want to be here. I don't need to sacrifice all that value with these onesie positions at quarterback and tight end. So for me, it's Waller. And if I miss out on Waller, it's Chigakonkwo and punt. And just take guys that I like a Gesicki, Jawan Johnson, Jelani Woods, like just these random dudes, and we'll see how it shakes out.
The FFPC ADP for these guys, just to run through sort of the top tight ends. Kelsey's 5th overall. Andrews is 21st. Hockenson is 32nd. Kittle is 42nd. Pitts is 50th. Goddard 53rd. Waller 62nd. And then you get into a bit of a gap there. So that's sort of where those guys are going in FFPC right now. Addison, give me your next player to avoid.
I'm sticking with the Niners here as my number 4 player. But I'm going with Deebo Samuel. And I mean, it was kind of laid out kind of nicely in the George Kittle argument, but with all of these pass catchers, it's really hard to trust any one of them when all 3 of them are healthy. So you're really hoping for an injury with any of them to kind of condense his target share a little bit smaller for the games that they play. But Deebo Samuel, I think the argument is kind of pretty easy and pretty plain. Number 1, he's being drafted at wide receiver 18. Brandon Ayuk is being drafted as wide receiver 30. Fun fact, Brandon Ayuk last year is wide receiver 15 in half PPR. Deebo Samuel is wide receiver 38. So already there's a discrepancy right there in terms of who the fantasy community thinks the wide receiver 1 in San Francisco is. And it's Brandon Ayuk, and he was more consistent. He stayed healthy the most. And Deebo Samuel is just kind of the more gadgety-ish kind of guy who doesn't really see a whole lot of targets and, tries to make up for that with rush attempts. But rush attempts, another problem. Christian McCaffrey's now in town. That was not an issue that Deebo Samuel had in 2021 in his massive breakout. Was not an issue that Deebo Samuel had at the beginning of the year last year. But when Christian McCaffrey came to town in week 7, Deebo Samuel's fantasy points after that point, 7, 6, 19, 6, 9, 12, 3. So basically, Christian McCaffrey came in and wiped away Deebo Samuel's rushing workload, or at least the volume that he was getting that was making him so good, on top of the receiving workload that Brandon Ayuk has now stolen away from him. So I don't get drafting Deebo Samuel, wide receiver 18. That is a crux piece of your roster. And if you miss out on that, you're really trying to play catch up through the remainder of the season to try to fill that gap if he's not hitting for you.
I am completely with you here. He's a top 45 pick in FFPC ADP data right now. I will roster him in 0 leagues if he keeps going that high. There is just no chance I'm taking him with the top 50 pick, given everything we saw last season. And you're right, given where other people in this offense, like Brandon Ayuk, are going instead. Erickson, give me your next player to avoid.
I'm going with Michael Pittman, wide receiver for the Indianapolis Colts, wide receiver 28, 67th overall. Look, people, this is the same argument I made with Deontay Johnson last year. Was you don't want wide receivers, even if they have high target shares, and offenses led by rookie quarterbacks. And especially when those rookie quarterbacks coming into the league don't necessarily boast the best accuracy traits and run a lot because you're taking total passing attempts out of the offense. Now we know the Colts' identity is they want to run the football. They didn't get that opportunity last year because they were down in so many different games that they had to throw the ball, and it didn't even help Michael Pittman at all. Like, he still underperformed based on the expectation that we all had for him to kind of take this massive breakout in his third season or in 2022. So for me, Michael Pittman, it just, yes, the target share is really nice. Maybe in a PPR can kind of work out, but he's also checking off all the red flags and the red boxes that I don't want for my wide receivers. Like, where's Pittman going to hit? I don't see how he's going to take a massive lead with a rookie quarterback that's mobile. I just don't see that happening. So for me, I'm not drafting him.
Addison, give me your next player to avoid.
It's Dameon Pierce, and I don't get this one either. RB20 in ADP. And look, you could be like, well, Dameon Pierce had a fantastic season last year, and by NFL standards, he absolutely did. In the 13 games that he played, almost put up 1,000 yards, was a monster in terms of the volume that he was getting, on pace for 290 carries, another 40 receptions. So a 330 touch season is what Dameon Pierce was on pace for, except that translates to RB22 in fantasy points per game in half PPR formats because he doesn't really catch the ball. He's completely dependent on the rushing volume that he is getting. And if he has 18 carries for 70 yards, that's a very good game log for an NFL running back. That is 7 fantasy points for you in your lineup at your RB2 slot. So there, I just don't really view Dameon Pierce having all that much upside. That was a perfect scenario and situation for him where he had no other competition at the running back position. Now they add in Devin Singletary. Now, I mean, the offense I think is going to be better because they added CJ Stroud, but there's still a rookie quarterback. Andrew just laid out exactly why we don't like offenses and receiving weapons with rookie quarterbacks. So I just don't necessarily see why Dameon Pierce is being valued ahead of where he was already producing last year in a possibly worse or neutral situation than what he was at last year. And there's really no upside. And players around him, Cam Akers is going right behind him. Way more upside in the Rams offense. James Conner right behind him. Rachaad White. Yeah, I would even take the discount. I know that Andrew doesn't like DeAndre Swift, but I'd rather have DeAndre Swift at a little bit of a discount than Dameon Pierce. So I'm not buying into Pierce's ADP there because I don't think that you're going to get all that much out of him on a weekly basis.
He had 5 total touchdowns last season. 4 of them were rushing, 1 of them receiving. Do you think, given that I do think it'll be an upgraded offense, just because I think Stroud is such a huge upgrade at quarterback, even as a rookie, do you think he'll get more than 5 touchdowns this year?
It's possible for sure. I mean, I could definitely see him getting up to 7 or 8, but that's really not going to change all that much over the course of an entire season. You might just have one more game where he scores 13 points because he scored a touchdown than he did, 6 points. So it really doesn't make a whole massive amount of difference for me if he scores a couple more touchdowns. I'm really looking for guys who have that opportunity, but then also can give me something in the receiving game. And Pierce just didn't necessarily have that going for him last year.
Erickson, who's your next player?
T. Higgins, wide receiver for the Cincinnati Bengals, wide receiver 12, 27th overall. And it's as simple as T. Higgins is not a fantasy wide receiver 1 when Jamar Chase is healthy. Like, we look at the splits, he's averaged 12 fantasy or less than 12 fantasy points per game and half-point scoring when Jamar Chase has been healthy. That does not translate to wide receiver 1 production. That is middle wide receiver 2 production between wide receiver 18 and wide receiver 23 if you look at the data over the past 2 seasons. So it's not me saying, oh, well, T. Higgins sucks. Like, he's not going to be a good fantasy player. I'm just looking at his cost. Because when you're looking at guys at the top, they're at the top for a reason. Like, for the most part, these guys are all good players. But you have to take a stand somewhere where the price does not match the projection and their actual outlook. And right now, Higgins' ADP is based on, okay, well, now Chase is going to miss games or something? Like, okay, if that's what you think is going to happen, then sure, you should draft T. Higgins as wide receiver 12. But I think Chase is going to lead the NFL in receiving yards. So I don't want T. Higgins because he's going to be a player that is not going to be returning his value. If anything, if he finishes wide receiver 18, that's not going to kill you, but you're going to be disappointed because I drafted him as wide receiver 12 and I got him as wide receiver 18 because Jamar Chase stayed healthy all year long. That's my issue with T. Higgins at his current price.
He's going as a mid 3rd round pick right now in 12-team leagues. I'm with you. I think Chase, I think there might be even another leap from him this year, and he kind of even blows away like Justin Jefferson as the best receiver in football. He's a monster. And if that happens, it is going to eat into what Higgins does. And Higgins, of course, has not been able to stay healthy for, full seasons very often in his career himself. So, I'm with you there. Addison, give me your next player.
I'm going with another player that switched teams this year, and I think that is seeing a little bit more hype because of that team switch, but it's DJ Moore, wide receiver 19 in ADP, now playing for the Chicago Bears. And I think this one, everybody's seeing, the quarterback upgrade. Justin Fields is the best quarterback that DJ Moore has had probably in his entire career, even probably dating back to college. And I definitely get that. But the math on this one just ain't mathing for me. I mean, you're looking at a team that already threw under 400 pass attempts last year. So even if we project that they throw 100 more times this year than they did last year, if DJ Moore sees an elite 28 to 29% target share, that only equates out to 130 targets on the season, which is solid. But unless you're seeing, 7, 8, 9 touchdowns in a season, which, DJ Moore has never seen more than 7 touchdowns in a single season, then you can't be a wide receiver one at that target share, that target number. So I think that what we're seeing here is DJ Moore in kind of the exact same role and situation as what he's had in Carolina. And he might honestly have a little bit more target competition this year because Darnell Mooney will be coming back from injury. Chase Claypool is still there too. They add in Roshan Johnson as well, who's actually a pretty formidable pass catcher out of the backfield, surprisingly enough. And Khalil Herbert will also be coming back too. So I'm not understanding where the math is coming from, where DJ Moore is going to be anything more than what he's already been in Carolina, seeing 110 to 125 targets maybe on a low passing volume team. And to me, that's not going to equate to a lot of consistent and sustainable production for him over a weekly basis. He's going to give you games. Absolutely. He did that in Carolina. He'll do that for you in Chicago. But wide receiver 19 to me, again, kind of like Deebo Samuel, where he's a core piece of your offense in your starting lineup. I just don't understand that price because I think that he's going to be closer to wide receiver 30 than he is wide receiver 10 or wide receiver 12.
Erickson, who's your next guy?
Ken Walker, RB14, 30th overall for the Seattle Seahawks. Got a couple reasons here. Receiving ability or their lack of. Look, I don't think Ken Walker showed as a rookie that he could be relied on as a receiver. They were consistently moving him out to use DJ Dallas and Travis Homer and these other running backs in the passing game. So I don't know what his role is in the offense. They added Zach Charbonnet in the second round with 52nd overall selection. And Charbonnet, what did he do at the college level? He caught passes. He caught way more passes than Ken Walker ever did. So I think that matters when you're looking at how did the Seahawks approach this draft. They drafted a player like Zach Charbonnet, whose exact profile does everything well that Ken Walker doesn't do well. They didn't draft an explosive running back. That's Ken Walker's role. He's the guy that's going to hit the home runs for their offense. But we know that's not something that's super consistent. Looking at rushing yards over expectation, I'm sure that Ken Walker's probably going to be off the charts in that metric heading into next season. But how much of that is going to actually translate into fantasy production? Because what translates to fantasy production? Catching passes and red zone usage. And picking up first downs, moving the chains, those types of things. That's what Zach Charbonnet does the best. That's what he did at the collegiate level. So, he was 5th highest PFF receiving grade, tied for first in receptions per game among his draft class. He boasts size. So I just think that Zach Charbonnet actually checks off boxes of a legitimate threat to Ken Walker, because at the end of the day, they also didn't need to draft a running back at all. That's why we're so shocked. It's we have Ken Walker slated up to be an RB1, but then they just decided to draft another running back who really fills in the holes of Ken Walker's game that we would just assume that, Ken Walker will just clean these things up. They'll use him more in the passing game. He'll be more consistent on a down-to-down basis. But because last year he wasn't, lowest in success rate. So for me, Zach Charbonnet, his impact on this offense with Ken Walker, RB14 is just too pricey for me.
Where would you take Walker? Because obviously he's down for a lot of people after the Charbonnet pick, but still a talented guy who they invested high draft capital in just a year ago and who had a pretty good rookie season. So he's going around the 40 range, I think 41st in FFPC data overall. How much further down would he need to drop for you to take him?
I'm just peeking a look at my overall ranks to kind of get an idea so that I'm not lying to myself about Ken Walker, because I know I have him more in the RB2 range. So for me, he's probably going he's got to probably be like in the 60s a little bit more. Like I'm fine with him as like my RB2, but RB14 is kind of like, okay, like he's now being viewed as like a high end RB2, whereas I want him more as a low end RB2 because he's still like an incomplete product. Like, yes, he was good last year at the end of the season when he had all the volume to himself. Like, I don't think that he's that much dissimilar than Dameon Pierce, where Dameon Pierce got a ton of volume. And when Rashad Penny got hurt, Kenneth Walker got a ton of volume. And I was kind of blinded by that a little bit and his explosive running style. And I wasn't looking at, oh, yeah, like they're not using him in the passing game like at all. And, oh, yeah, like his success rate is really bad. And who didn't ignore these things? The Seattle Seahawks. Because clearly they knew them because that's why they drafted Zach Charbonnet in the second round, which matters a lot. Like, I want to hit this home that when you draft a running back in the second round, not the third round, like I understand that they're both day 2 picks, and us as draft analysts, as pundits or whatever, it's easy for us to cluster those players together. Day 2 draft capital is way different, round 2 draft capital is significantly more important than round 3. Like, so I just want to like really hit that home that it's not the same. Like Zach Charbonnet and Tank Bigsby are not the same. Like as prospects and what their draft capital indicates and suggests, it's not the same thing.
Well, speaking of Tank Bigsby, we're actually going to wrap up with you guys both pick players from the same team. Addison is Travis Etienne as his number 1 player to avoid. Erickson, you have Trevor Lawrence. So both of you guys, I guess, are down on the Jags. Starting with you, Addison, why are you low on Etienne?
Well, Tank Bigsby is a big argument for that, I think. And I'm not a Tank Bigsby guy. I even was saying up until the draft that I don't even know if Tank Bigsby was a top 10 running back in this year's class. But essentially, when you look at Travis Etienne's profile, and again, I guess kind of sticking with my theme of running backs who are being drafted higher than where they actually produced last year, Travis Etienne, in his perfect role in a post-James Robinson world last year, averaged 12.4 half PPR points per game from week 6 on. That was running back 15 on through that stretch last year. Now being drafted as running back 13. So that already is kind of interesting to me. Then you add the addition of Tank Bigsby. And I don't love Tank Bigsby, but he signals something to me that Doug Peterson does not want Travis Etienne to see a lion's share of the volume and the touches in this backfield. He is going to eat into Travis Etienne's workload. And the funny part about Etienne was that he was a very productive receiver coming out of college with Trevor Lawrence. And he had like 70 or 80 receptions over the past 2 years in Clemson coming out of college, and then had like 30 receptions all last year. So the receiving volume wasn't really there. The rushing volume was good, but it just, you don't want running backs who are only really rushing for the primary point of their production. And you're paying RB13, borderline RB1 prices for those kind of guys. I don't want to be doing that for Travis Etienne and what I think will be a better Jaguars offense. But Tank Bigsby is just a big time signal to me that this is not going to be Travis Etienne's backfield. They don't want it to be. And even though he might not be good, Etienne is going to be, hurt by the fact that Tank Bigsby is there stealing away touches.
Erickson, why are you down on the Jags?
I'm just down on the price. Look, I have nothing against Trevor Lawrence. I think that he can improve off of his QB8 status from last year, but I'm not willing to do it when I can draft Justin Herbert as QB7. Justin Herbert in the ECR is going 4 spots ahead of Trevor Lawrence. Justin Herbert has shown as a rookie and a second-year passer that he can average over 22 points per game. In 2021, Justin Herbert scored the second most fantasy points of all players behind Josh Allen. And he's going barely ahead of Trevor Lawrence, who has yet to crest 20 fantasy points per game in any of his 2 seasons. So it's all about the price with quarterbacks. Again, going back to tight end, it's all about the price. Because when I look at the quarterback rankings, I'm like, okay, I agree with these, but where can I get the most bang for my buck? If Trevor Lawrence, I draft him as QB8, he finished as QB4, that's good. That's a positive investment. If I draft Justin Herbert as QB7 and he finishes as QB2, that's a better investment of how I use my quarterback draft capital. And then I'm looking on the other side of the coin. Geno Smith averaged more fantasy points per game last year than Trevor Lawrence did. Why am I going to take Trevor Lawrence as QB8 when I can draft Geno Smith as QB14 and he's going to do maybe the same amount of production as Trevor Lawrence, maybe a little bit less, but they just added Jackson Smith and Jigba. Why can't Geno Smith just do exactly what Trevor Lawrence did last year and I get him at QB14? So you got to be, and this goes back to a lot of my avoids and busts. It's about the price. You got to look at the ADP because it's not just Trevor Lawrence you're drafting as QB8. It's Trevor Lawrence plus the guys that you drafted earlier. So when I'm looking at, okay, if I draft Trevor Lawrence here and who I can get where I would draft Geno Smith versus the reversal of that, I'm probably going to like my team a lot more with the running back receiver I can pair with Geno Smith versus the running back or wide receiver I'm going to pair with Trevor Lawrence if I draft him as QB8 overall. So there's nothing really about Trevor Lawrence that to me is like, oh, I'm really down on this particular player besides the fact that I think his rushing value is a little bit overblown because there's a reason why he hasn't gotten to over 20 fantasy points per game because he's not this savant rusher. He rushed for 500 yards or he rushed for 5 touchdowns last year. That may not happen again, especially with how Etienne is due for positive touchdown regression. Have you heard about this Take Bigsby guy? He's going to be rushing for a lot of rushing touchdowns from what I hear from around the Twitter sphere. So I don't see Trevor Lawrence necessarily duplicating his 5 rushing touchdowns from last year. And I just think that there are much better value bets on the board at quarterback than Trevor Lawrence as QB8.
We're going to wrap things up there. Don't forget to check out the FFPC Fantasy Pros Championship. And also don't forget to comment on this video and subscribe to the channel for a chance to win a free premium upgrade to Fantasy Pros for an entire year. For Andrew Erickson and Addison Hayes, I'm Ryan Wormeli. Thank you guys for joining us. We will see you again next time.